In the previous session, we explored the role of the reader in the communication process. In this session, we will focus on one of the main exponents of hermeneutical theory, namely Hans-Georg Gadamer. And then we will follow in the next session the person and influence of Paul Ricoeur. Hermeneutics have many preeminent exponents, and we shall unfortunately not be able to discuss all of them. I hope you will do that on your own and discover your own favorite representative. What I'll do here in this session is to focus on one of the giants, not of theological hermeneutics, but of philosophical hermeneutics, but who had a huge influence also on theology, and that is Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher, originally from Marburg, and taught at many of the German universities and ended in Heidelberg. Now, there's an interesting history about how Gadamer developed as somebody practicing philosophical hermeneutics. His first book, and that was the major book, Truth and Method, or Waarheid und Methode, was published when he was 60 years old, in 1960. That was his first major publication. So what he brings to the table is a very mature, worked out system of understanding how, according to him, the process of communication works. And as you know from Dirk Smith's introduction, that the publisher originally did not want to publish the title as Gadamer presented it, namely a philosophical hermeneutics. He said, what is this hermeneutics? Nobody will understand it. Let's make it truth and method, and then people will know. So Gadamer was not the first exponent of philosophical hermeneutics. They were important precursors. Schleiermacher showed that misunderstanding and the misinterpretation of text is not just an accidental thing that happens in certain cases, but it is a universal problem, the possibility of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. And therefore, all forms of human communication is subjected to this possibility. And therefore, the need for hermeneutics is actually universal, and we're dealing with a universal problem. And by doing so, he has opened up the field for the whole field of the humanities and beyond. Now, following Schleiermacher, Dilthey made a very interesting contribution to the development of hermeneutics. He also accepts that understanding is a historical process, and it's a process that happens between individuals. But more than that, the result of this understanding between individuals could be that it leads to certain, what he calls artifacts, certain expressions of culture and of history, in the forms of a monument, in the forms of a work of art, or any other cultural object. So for him, it is not only an communication between individuals or persons, we also have to look at what a culture produces. And these cultural objects also have communicative potential. So if we analyze historical cultural objects, this could help us to understand what were the ideas of a certain time and a certain context. So not looking alone at texts in the forms of written documents, but also the wider expressions in culture could be an important source for the understanding of a specific era and time frame. The second important contribution of Dilthey is that he made a clear distinction between the way that natural sciences go about in finding solutions and what happens in the human sciences. And he tied that to two concepts. The way the natural sciences proceeds, according to him, is a process of erklären. That means a process of explaining. You explain a physical phenomenon. You explain the maths behind it. You explain the physical laws that work there. And that in itself is sufficient. But he says, when we move over to the human side, to the humanities, or the Geisteswissenschaften, as he calls it, then we need more than just explaining phenomena. We need a further step, which he calls verstehen. We then have to understand also, not only explain, but understand with insight, acceptance, and appropriation. So in his mind, there is a clear divide between what works in the natural sciences and what works in the humanities. And for that reason, he develops two types of hermeneutics to deal with these two worlds. Now, the third example, precursor of Gadamer, is a person like Heidegger, which had a huge influence on a whole generation of theologians, including Bultmann and his school. And Heidegger places the hermeneutical issue in the widest possible context, to include not only textual communication or history, but human existence itself. For him, the problem is, in the end, an ontological problem. Our interpretation is not only of a message, but it is of reality itself. And we deal with reality, we cope with reality by an ongoing process of interpretation. So when what he calls our attempts to understand reality and to make sense of reality is that we really create in the process designs for living. Now, Gadamer agrees with much of the insights of these predecessors, especially that hermeneutics is a universal challenge and that it affects all dimensions of life. So it is a basic phenomenon of our existence. Gadamer, in contrast to what we will be seeing when we talk about recur, experience distance between the original text and the present reader, distance between the experience of the original message and that of the interpreter as a problem. And this distancing is the challenge to overcome through a fusion of these two horizons. So it's important to keep that in mind. When we come to recur, we'll see that his understanding is distanciation, or distance and strangeness is really an asset. So we must overcome this distance, according to Gadamer, between the context of the original event of understanding and where we find ourselves. The problem, Gadamer says, that we that interpret find ourselves always in midstream. We are already conditioned by what happened to us in the past, by our culture, by our life experience. And there is never a sort of a clean, uncontaminated starting point. We cannot wipe out our own life experience. It is part of who we are. And therefore, he says we are in the middle of things. And this is the dilemma of the hermeneutical question, how to deal with that. Furthermore, Gadamer says that it is not only this distance between us, but what also separates the original situation from our interpretation is that the only way we can deal with these two aspects is through language. Language is the only instrument we can use to close the gap, or to talk about the gap, or to understand the gap. And language for him is the essential skill or component to overcome the problem. There's the interesting saying, ons bestaan talend tussen vraag en antwoord. We exist in language between question and answer, and that really describes in a many ways the position of Gadamer. So Gadamer, coming back to his truth and method, says there are many attempts to cut out the fuzziness and the slipperiness of what language brings with itself. There's an attempt to rationalize, to contain it to what is measurable and what is objective and rational. It's something similar to what Ricoeur later will say, the attempt to bog down or to clamp down the reference of the text. And therefore, Gadamer also comes back to the two basic distinctions between erklären, and that is to explain, and verstehen, and that is to understand, is the modes of the natural and human senses. But then he says, despite the attempt to clamp down on the slipperies of language, we don't get to truth. There's the scientific method, whatever its advantages may be, really does not produce truth in the full sense of the word, and therefore it is not suitable for the human sciences. Now, in this process, an important aspect of Gadamer's theory is that of pre-understanding, Vorverständnis. That is part of finding ourselves in midstream. We are already burdened by a certain view of reality, by a certain history, by a certain way of looking at things. And therefore, in order to get rid of this or to revise this pre-understanding, we must enter the hermeneutical circle. That means we must expose ourselves to an alternative way of looking at reality, and that is what the text offers us. And then if we do that, we come to a new pre-understanding, which again then starts the process again in the form of the hermeneutical circle. But the final goal is to fuse these two different horizons. That is where understanding really takes place. So let me mention just one final concept of Gadamer, and that is what he calls Wirkungsgeschichte, or effective history. It's very difficult to translate this. But what he tries to say is that the history of interpretation, the way that we interpret things, also have an effect on what follows after our own interpretations. It affects the history of interpretation, and it has a certain legacy that flows through to new generations of interpretations. So for Gadamer, Wirkungsgeschichte is really an expression of the power of tradition. Tradition does have an effect on future generations, and you have to deal with that. So to summarize the importance of Gadamer, for him, hermeneutics and the hermeneutical process is really a mode of being. This is how we exist as humans. This is how we deal with reality. And this is how we open new possibilities. And he has, because of these fundamental insights, has had an enormous influence on how philosophical and, as I said in the beginning, theological hermeneutics developed subsequently.